Hello, everyone. Chorle, that is a greeting in my indigenous Magar language. Good morning to many of you, but it's good evening time for some of us as well. To day 3 of, or the final day of IFIP Funders Retreat of Track B. We had an amazing session, Track A session this evening for some of us. So I'm Chanda Thapa Magar from Nepal and a new IFIP team member, recently joined. We actually started on day 1. We actually started the dialogue, questioning and reflecting on like how we arrived to this retreat. Where are we? And on day 2, we ended with a very rich discussions on identifying with great ideas of our priorities, what should be for IFIP as a global community and funders, a philanthropy community globally. There was so much of interaction and then rich discussion on those topics. We had quite an amazing session yesterday as well, both on track A and track B, very, very important topics we discussed. And our community members, they shared their experiences, personal experiences and reflections at institutional level, personal level, the kind of work they have been doing for so far. There was very important discussion we have had on the impact of racism on indigenous peoples, where our community member Janine Yazi from Six World Solutions, she shared that as a global community, how much we need to be careful about and then be thoughtful on the situation, that how dangerous it can be to confront the white supremacy that we have been dealing like so far. And also, if the philanthropy does not actively support indigenous-led funding to address the power structures that has been created for so long, to dismantle that structural barrier, then it cannot really support the indigenous self-determination of indigenous peoples. So we also discuss about how we can decolonize philanthropy. I think this has been a very important discussion having among the philanthropy communities, and for me also it's been quite being a new to philanthropy world, it has been quite a great learning to understand the context, because I come from a very like local background, working with local communities, indigenous communities. So it has been quite an eye-opening for what is happening at this global level, because we do complain a lot to the funders. So I think there's the discussion about like, I think the discussion is how we can also, for the funders community, for philanthropy community globally also, to understand the complexity at the ground level among the communities that we are working with, and then also recognize like how diverse the political, cultural, economic context of each communities before making or having, before any kind of intervention that we put forward. So those discussions also added with some conversation over the effective and meaningful representation of intersectional groups. We have been quite, the intersectional groups are into the forefront, like recently into the forefront, but still their representation, their participation, their engagement in the decision-making processes are not sufficient, or they are like lagging behind those processes. So it's very, very important for us to have this understanding of like inclusion should not be in the name of like just as token to these groups, but they should be able to have their representation as at the decision making level, and they should be able to Fimi and Dewey from Disability Rights, who have been working very closely with the Indigenous women group globally and Indigenous person with disability. So beside those discussions, I think we also have had a very deeper conversation over the commitments that we have been making. We are very much willing to support. There is willingness, very good, good intention to support, but there are still some level of barriers that we are not being able to reach out to what we are expecting to achieve, and then work in collaboration with the communities, indigenous communities on the ground. So that we definitely can work together collectively, and then we have to keep pushing each other to reach that level. So on day 3, it's very important day, the final day, and very important for all of us as IFIP and also the whole community itself, where we will be having a very a deeper discussion over like how as philanthropic community should move ahead, what are our priorities, and then how we can build together a community to support our indigenous groups. So we had set up this interactive space, which you very well, it's quite amazing to see everyone so much engaged into that, and then you shared your ideas, great ideas, exciting ideas and thoughts to which is quite provoking, thought-provoking for all of us, which I feel will be seriously taking into consideration how we can move ahead in the coming year. So I'll just quickly share, go through that mural that you have, your thoughts are there, and then thank you Anka for helping to cluster all those ideas together. I'll just share the screen, and then yeah, okay, can you see the screen here? Okay, thank you. So we were just discussing before the session started, and we are quite thrilled to see the ideas we have had, and then maybe like we are also expecting a lot, but I think we need to skim through like what are more practical, and then what we can really do as collectively as a community. So few of them, like specifically coming from our community members from Australia, like we need to create and then strengthen the regional spaces more in coming days, creating more space for partnership and then collaboration. It can be through different thematic space, thematic or issue-based, like working groups, and then, like partnership that we can create. It can be, I think most of the ideas shared here are very much focused to the communities. Like we have to prioritize the communities, the needs and priorities of the communities, and it should be community led. So that has been quite, I think, common understanding. And then the idea that we have partnership with different, like even like philanthropic organizations, funders in these regions, like not only from the north to the south, between the funders of these regions, and also the community organizations that have been working in those indigenous organization in those regions. So I think we all agree that I think there are so many reasons that we are not being able to, like we want, but we are not being able to reach out to those communities, local level, as much as possible. So I think that's like we try to find ways to work together in collaboration, whether it's through IFIP or other funders communities, that we build that kind of collaboration to reach out to that level. So I think everyone agreed with this reciprocal relationship with the communities, where communities are the one to make decisions on any kind of processes or intervention. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, a very rich discussion in the inclusion and representation, meaningful and effective representation of intersectional groups, indigenous women, indigenous person with disability, youth, LGBTIQ community. So that's, they are also one of these are the groups who are just lagging behind in terms of like getting support for building their capacity or accessing resource mobilization or representation at all levels. So I think that's also more support are required, that everyone agree on that. I think this is also another one is about like having more convenings like this. I think IFIP has already committed to have this kind of event, and hopefully more. Lourdes will be sharing at the end like what are the plans of IFIP in coming days as well. So hopefully like the COVID situation gets better and we'll have more time to have in-person physical, create like more physical space. I think more events for track B, definitely. I think this space itself is an example like how IFIP is also being more inclusive towards this geographical diversity that we are working towards. Yeah, I think, yeah, creating more learning space to like exchange and learn from each other. I think Tanya has been very, very, like supportive, and then participating despite this, time difference. And then we see that how eager and then enthusiastic you all are to work together in collaboration. So I think we definitely can work together. Some of the example, I mean, like some of the suggestions that are already been given here. I mean, as you know, like IFIP also has this learning institute. Unfortunately, we are actually collaborating with NEED this year, but that has been a space for, more and more a space for our funders community to learn, to exchange our ideas and experiences. So some trainings, I think learning space, that how it, I think it also refers to. Yeah, I think, yeah, some of, yeah, you can always go back to this mural and then, look at it and then also add more comments on that. Yeah, it also talks about like building strong leadership. It's, I think, a lot of discussion we have had about how we build more leadership, indigenous leadership within the funders, like at institutional level, more agency to the staff, like having team members in the board of the philanthropic organizations as well. So I think that's also like growing leadership is there, but we have to definitely work together. And yeah, finally, lastly, like leading from the needs, of course, I think that's what I just said. I think that's all we need to work with. I know like yesterday, Monica was also sharing that there is a huge, like very strong commitment as institutional level, but still we have to work on that together. So yeah, that's, I'm sure like I haven't covered everything right now because of the time limitation, but yeah, you can definitely go back to it and how amazing it is to, and then we have to work together to make it happen. Yeah, in coming days. Yeah, I'll just stop here and yeah, hand over to Lourdes, who will be leading the next agenda of the day. Yeah, thank you, Lourdes.
Thank you, Shanda, for walking us through a recap of yesterday, and also look at the mural and all the wonderful ideas that the IFIP team has to now sit with and reflect. But they're all very exciting. Some, I think, that are aligned with some of the thinking that we already have, and some of the work that we're thinking of doing ahead, which includes work that to do a little more work about learning our membership. And there is certain pieces of work that we have in the past been unable to do because of the limited size of staff. But now that we are in a position of having a team of 5, which is very exciting, we're embarking in taking care of some of those long-awaited projects. And one of them is doing a membership analysis, understanding more the field, and then that would also lead us into another project that I'm going to invite my colleague Winnie Cody to share with you. Winnie, please take the floor.
Thank you, Lourdes. Hello, good morning, everyone, and good evening to some of you, and welcome back to day 3. I'm going to ask Kwalnaska, my colleague, to share a presentation with you. but as she does that, yes, so just as Lourdes mentioned about the membership analysis, I'm going to tell you where that comes from or how we get, or how we're able to do the membership analysis. So as IFIP, we have renewal forms or membership forms that we send, and these forms usually have questions on them, and this form and these questions would ask how much your annual grant budgets are, how much your total assets would be, the percentage of your grant making that goes directly to Indigenous peoples, what areas you fund in your organization, what geographic regions you work in, if it's local within your own countries, or if it's global, and also being very specific to the themes that you support Indigenous peoples on. So from this information, then we're able to do an analysis of our members. And why we do this is so that we're able to understand our membership better and see how we can better also engage with our membership, and also understand the funding trends in our membership. Why this is important is because the information that we get, I mean, first of all, IFIP wants to be more intentional with the data that we have, and how we can use this data, analyze it, synthesize it, so that we can use it to benefit our membership, give this information back to our member and see, so that they can also see what the funding trends are within our community, our IFIP community, to see what, to look at what priorities our membership has, what interests they have, what opportunities are available for our members to collaborate either with each other or with other Indigenous communities and organizations. And also another important aspect is to see what gaps are available that our membership can fill. So that's why this is important for us and for our membership as well. And then, so from this information, so this is what we can get, or what we hope to do with the information that we get from the questions that we ask in the membership form. So what we did over the last few months is that we looked at our membership between 2020 and 2021. And from a total of 49 members, which would be 40 members and 9 affiliates, we had 28 completed forms and 21 incomplete forms. So the information, the first part of the information I'm going to share with you is from the 28 completed forms that we have. And then later on, I'll be letting you know why it's important for you to completely fill out the form, so that, again, we're able to get complete information for us to be able to do the membership analysis at length, because this is something we intend to do. This is something that we intend to do later on. So this is just a preliminary report that I'm going to share. So again, as I said, the information that we collected are not complete. It's not complete, so it doesn't reflect our entire membership. It only reflects the portion of the membership that completely filled the form. And so I think you can go to the next slide, Onaska. And so what you can see there is the annual grant budget for the 28 members who completely filled the form. And that's the total that's the total that it comes to. And then the percentage that is allocated to Indigenous peoples is the amount that you can see there. That's the amount that is allocated by the 28 members to specifically fund Indigenous peoples. And so 17 of these organizations give between 80 and 100% of their budget to indigenous peoples, and most of those that, or all of those that give 100% of their budget are either indigenous peoples organizations or indigenous-led funds. And the other 11 organizations give between 3 and 60% of their budgets to indigenous peoples. And so after looking at that, what we did now, so that we can look at the information that we had more broadly, and because we have access to finding out the themes that now the entire membership funds, we looked at what our entire membership funds, and then what you can see on the circle there is the different themes that is funded by our membership. And just because we can't go through each and every single theme that we have, we just clustered them to 3 of the most funded themes, and this came to rights in general. So this could be indigenous people's rights, it could be racial justice or racial equality, gender justice, gender equity, human rights, disability rights. And then the second theme was environmental justice, education and conservation, and the third one was climate change. Something that we wanted to also note, because again, at IFIP we have an Indigenous Women's Working Group, and we also have a Territories Working Group, and so we wanted to see how many of our members directly support or have explicitly said that they support Indigenous women or support women or lands and territories, and 15% of the organization support women initiatives, and 11, which is 5 of them, support land and territories. So this doesn't mean that it's only the 7 or the 5 that support Indigenous women, because we appreciate that there's intersectionalities between things, and so but these are the ones who explicitly stated in their forms or stated in their forms that they support women or support land and territories. And then next, we looked at the geographies that were covered within our membership, and a large number of our membership, that's 35%, 16 members, give grants in the US and in Canada. And then we have 28% who work globally. And then something to notice that some of these organizations are also very geographic specific, where they either fund specific geographies, so maybe we'll say Latin America only, or some of them only fund specific states within the United States. Some of them, it's specific countries across the globe. So you'll find maybe they fund India and Mexico and say Peru, and not, so those are the only 3 countries they work in globally. So that is also another trend that we saw during the analysis. And then for Australia, we have 11% of the membership, that's 5 organizations that fund exclusively in Australia and in New Zealand. So next, here is just a constellation map that we found from Foundations Map by Candid, and it's just a snapshot of it's just a representation of our members, both private and public, foundations and Indigenous-led funds who report to Foundation Maps. So if you do not report, then the information is not there on the Foundation Maps, and then we can't put you up on the constellation. So some of our members are actually not in this database, and we would like to encourage that you consider reporting to the Foundation's map, so that your information is there, and then you're able to, when we're looking at what the funding trends are, we're able to look at that, and to find that information also on the Foundation map. So what what's next? Our next steps as IFIP is to commission a complete global funding landscape analysis. And that's why we talked about how we collect information. So this information that you provide to us would help us in doing the global funding analysis, and also to gather data focusing on funding to Indigenous-led organizations and Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women's organizations. So to help us do this again, for our members, we ask that you completely fill the application form, the renewal form. And for our members in waiting, those of you who want to join us, we also ask that when we send you the application form, that you also completely fill the form so that we're able to get this information. And then again, just so that we have information to help us gather, to have this report that we would be able to give back to you and help us as a community to, as we mentioned earlier, help our membership connect, collaborate, and again, determine fields that are available in the funding field within our membership. So in a few months, we will be sending out the membership renewal for some of you, and hopefully we're going to send out new applications for many of you, and we hope that we'll be able to gather this information when that time comes. And then another thing that I wanted to share with you today is our IFIP communication strategy. So within the IFIP strategic framework, communication is one aspect that we highlighted as something that we needed to enhance, so that we can continue to provide a platform to our membership, to our community, that enables the self-determined development of Indigenous peoples, and creating space for our members to connect and collaborate so that we can continue to expand and improve the funding opportunities for Indigenous issues. So how then would we do this is we reviewed our strategic framework, and we found that we needed to better use our website and other communications channels, so if it's social media, if it's in-person communication, so that we're able to better meet the needs of our community. So drawing from the responses that we've been having over the past 2 days, like earlier on when Chanda put up the new robot, when we looked at some of those responses, some of the responses that you give to us actually speaks directly to how we can improve our communication with our community. And some of the responses were that you'd like to see the IFIP community bloom through regionalized networks, a global resource center, or a global resource for Indigenous philanthropy, giving Indigenous news and information. And there are many recommendations that spoke directly to our strategic framework. And so drawing from this conversation the conversations that we've been having over the last 2 days, and from previous discussions that we've also had internally, we want to invite all of you to be part of IFIP's website update and rebrand. And we will be seeking your input into how we want to, into how we design this space to best meet your needs, to best meet all of our needs. And in the next few weeks, we will be sharing a survey with you that will ask you questions that will help us feed into our update and rebrand process. And we hope that together we can create a space that will support you, that will give you the information that you need, provide you with a platform that will support and uplift your work so that we can continue to see this IFIP community bloom. So we hope that in the next few weeks when we come calling that we will get positive responses from you. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate and continuing to work with you. Thank you very much. I think I'll pass this back to Kwandaska. And if you have any questions or any comments, please feel free to do so at this time. I think we have a few minutes before Lourdes takes over.
Hello, everybody. I just wanted to know if anybody has any questions, or do we want to congratulate Winnie on the great presentation she did? The floor is everybody's right now. We have a couple of minutes for that. And if not, it's totally okay. Just wanted to leave the floor open for that. I see some clapping of hands in the background. Okay.
I think Yuri had a question.
Oh, Yuri, go ahead.
Sorry, I had the same question when I listened to this presentation in track A earlier. So I wanted to ask it, which is, can you explain the foundation map constellations, like what the dots and the tentacles, what all that represents?
Yes. I wish I could share my. Okay. So the dots, the blue dots would be funders and recipients, right? So again, as I had mentioned earlier, it's a representation of the private and public foundations. So when we put up the information, can I show that for just a few minutes? The foundation map.
Yeah. While you're showing that, I can also help explain, Winnie, while you're putting it up on screen.
Let me just put it up so that you can.
Yeah. So IFIP for a long time has been wanting to have access to this data. Finally, we're in a position of having access to the data. And that constellation map represents different ways and you can look at data. There's many ways that you can look at the data. And I believe when we were looking at the search, Cage's Foundation, actually, I think we found Cage's Foundation, which is one of our members in Australia. But what you do is reporting this information to Candid, and the constellation gives you a sense of knowing where your own foundation is in collaborating with other funders. And so I think the green dots represent some of the large foundations or private foundations, and the orange dots represent the recipients. So it's a way that we can start understanding how our membership is collaborating or not collaborating, or where the clusters of collaborations are and where the outliers are as well. And and then you can start also seeing who are just entering funding more Indigenous peoples, because they're still in the process of starting their giving, right? And so there's different ways that you can use this information. But one of the ways that IFIP would like to use it is to also share it back with the membership and see who are all your funding in common. And that's why one of the ways of doing that is it's reporting to your data to Candid. Winnie, go ahead.
Yeah. So, okay. So we could actually, if we name search, we can actually see where your organization would pop up on the foundation map. So, for instance, maybe I could try some advice.
And Winnie, could you unclick the little box that says U.S. Federal? Sorry, I don't have my glasses, but the U.S. Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks. You could also use a safe search.
Okay, so that's how.
You want to go to where, see the little pin, Save Searches, and find it there?
Yeah,
there.
yeah, just a moment. So. Okay, yeah, so this is the image that I shared earlier. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So, yeah, okay. So now, for instance, we can see Tamalpais there. You can see Ford. Yeah. So when you put in any name of whichever foundation or whichever funder you want to search, then it would come up on the map, on the like we decided to do a constellation so that we just see where they are and who they fund. And so this is what comes up. But again, this information would be available to you if you're subscribed to the foundation's map. But then again, just to reiterate what is said is that if you're not already reporting, then we would strongly encourage you to do so. Yeah. All right.
I think I saw Christy wanting to ask a question.
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks very much, Winnie. I'm happy to have caught this presentation at a later day today, and I would like to apologize that we have not been sending information we're guilty of that, and I'm hoping we could. But one of the questions that we always have when we produce maps is how do we secure the information of our partners, but also sensitive information when it would be actually risky for them or anybody in a wider public knows that they're actually getting resources from us. So I'll give you a very specific answer. For example, is that we do support organizations, for example, in Myanmar and also in Papua. And there are times when actually the information becomes sensitive because of political conditions. And so how do we guard the information not being available or used for any other intentions that other other organizations may when they get the information.
Thank you, Christy, for that question. I think in Sandana would most likely be listed as a recipient of some of these funders. And I don't think then, unless your organization, Sandana is specifically reporting to Foundation Center, because you're based outside the States, I don't think that they would be able to see who you're granting. So that's one. The way Foundation Candid, sorry, now it's called Candid works is that they take foundations here, public and private foundations, and not to go into a big discussion on this topic, but they take the information from the annual tax return and get some of this information out of that, and other information is because it's voluntarily. But I believe, just speaking from my days at the Christensen Fund, foundations have ways of ensuring that some of those grants are not shared, and particularly if they're sensitive. So there's other vehicles in which funders do giving so that information from the grantees it's not publicly available. And so that's something that certainly we experienced at the Christensen Fund, and we found ways of ensuring that that was the case. But in this particular kind of situation, in terms of general, if we're not in a situation of ensuring the safety of a grantee, one is certainly not listing them on your website that you're giving them grants to. But in general, I think reporting to, and I'm not endorsing Candid per se. There's a lot of issues with how data is represented, more than I think I want to spend time explaining on this conversation. But nevertheless, it's important for IFIP to understand how our members increasing or not increasing their giving to Indigenous. For Indigenous right now is for Indigenous peoples. But what we want to get is to understand how much of that money or that funding is actually going to Indigenous-led organizations. And there's a lot of things that IFIP can do in conversations with Candid to influence how they're tracking data and how they are representing data that is tagged as supporting Indigenous people.
So maybe instead of trying to go into additional questions in this, maybe we can have a side line, Lourdes, to discuss this, because I think this is important in terms of reach, in terms of what I'm saying, scaling out rather than scaling up and reaching as many Indigenous groups as possible. So I won't belabor this conversation. But thank you very much for that.
No, but you have a valid point, Christy. It is a valid point. And I think particularly those who are funding human rights or rights, as funders, you do need to think about those things and take the certain steps to protect your grantees if they're asking you not to list them or to publicly put them on your websites. But thank you, Christy.
Okay, thanks very much.
All right, so with that, I think I'm gonna invite, was there any other questions? Sorry, I lost track if there's somebody else asking a question. No? All right, so I think I am inviting Anka to take the floor.
Yes, hello everyone. Welcome to day 3. We're already knee deep in discussions. The Foundation Center discussion is getting us to the more concrete things that we want to talk about. And it's one, Christy, that as you can see, everyone in the chat was also talking about. So it's one that's on everyone's mind, I'll say including mine. But I wanted to ground us in what will now appear as the Foundation Center, but not the Foundation Center, but rather in day 3 of the IFIP 2021 retreat, and quickly scan over what we've done so far. So as a reminder, I think almost all of you were in day 1. We talked about how did we get here. We looked at the past year and reflected on, some of the very difficult challenges that we have confronted over the past year and still are. Day 2, yesterday, we were talking about where are we today and what is it that we want. Already in those conversations, we started kind of thinking of the future and grappling with really difficult topics that are still obviously going to be present in our future. And today what we're going to do is talk about where are we going and how will we get there. So today is going to be more about action. It's action oriented. The style of our breakouts today are more of a Minka style. So we have had discussions up until now, and Minka, as Lourdes explained at the beginning of the week, is a collaborative space where everyone gets together and works towards the same goal together, right? So that's what we're prompting us all to do today. In track A, we had 3 breakouts. In track B, we will have 2, where we're doing again what we did yesterday, where we're fusing one of the topics with the other 2 breakouts. So we'll hear from Monica in just a little bit. She's going to talk to us about Indigenous-led funds, roles and lessons of philanthropy and their communities. And then we will have 2 breakouts. So breakout 7, we're going to focus on collaboration to extend support to Indigenous communities and smaller organizations. And breakout 8, we'll talk about funder accountability. Funder accountability to the communities they claim to be serving and supporting, right? So again, very big topics and trying to get to more action. So I will stop here, but just to frame what we're all about to hear from our 3 speakers, it is about these 3 breakouts, and then in a little bit we'll come back and we'll do today's interactive that is focusing on our commitments, right? What commitments are we making for 2020, right? Yesterday we have put out on the mural a bunch of ideas, and now we're going to think collectively about how we can accomplish them within the IFIP community. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Lourdes, so you can introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Anka. All right, so we are entering into the community dialogues, and just as I enter, I lost my cue here. Okay, there we go. So as Anka was mentioning, we're going to start with hearing from Monica Leman, who will be sharing on Indigenous-led funds and lessons of philanthropy, and touch on how why Ford is supporting Indigenous-led funds. To introduce Monica, can we please invite her to the spotlight? Monica Leman Cunningham is a new senior program officer on the Ford Foundation's Build team, working to advance the foundation's efforts to support and develop stronger, sustainable, and more effective social justice organizations at networks across the globe. Prior to her role in the Build team, she was based in the foundation's East Africa office, where her grant-making focused on increasing the capacity of national, regional, and global groups, and supporting national and regional networks to advance constitutional framework that protects the rights of women and other minorities. Monica was executive director of the International Indigenous Women's Forum, a network of Indigenous women's organizations in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and her extensive background includes community organizing and social movement building. With that, I invite you to take the floor, Monica.
Thank you, and hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. It is such a pleasure for me to be here. I am very, very happy to just get an opportunity to know you and to learn about you. I sit on the IFIP board as a co-chair, and I must confess to you that Lourdes has been really encouraging the board of IFIP to embrace our work in other regions of the world, and your region being one that has been highlighted as a key priority for us. So I am very, very happy that we are starting with this, but our hope with Lourdes and other members of the board is that hopefully that we will grow our presence and our capacity to be more responsive to some of the questions that you have been asking of IFIP. So as Lourdes said, I do work at the Ford Foundation. Right now I am at home. It's about 10 p.m. I invite you to my gallery. This is what I do on my COVID nights, but that's just a way of living and trying to interpret a different part of ourselves. At the key question that Lourdes asked me to respond to was, why does the Ford Foundation support Indigenous-led funds? And I first have to start by saying that the Ford Foundation is one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the world. We are beginning to support Indigenous-led funds. We are not, I will say, where I wish the Ford Foundation should be right now, but we are beginning the process of supporting Indigenous-led funds. So the question will be answered from the perspective of an institution that is just beginning that journey, and from a place of knowing that we have not always done this work and those partnerships right. We have commitment at the level of our trustees and at the level of our executive leadership to support and prioritize our work with Indigenous organizations in different parts of the world. But there are 4 reasons that for us represent the key driver to supporting Indigenous-led funds. The first one is that it provides a new opportunity to define intercultural philanthropy. We want to better understand what does reciprocity and complementarity looks like when providing funding. Number 2, we see this as an opportunity to democratize resources to community-based organization. The Ford Foundation average size grant is about $200,000. So obviously we struggle with providing grants to organizations that are smaller and that are community-based. One of our limitations is that one of our rules is that we do not like to represent more than 25% of the overall budget of an organization. So investing in some of the Indigenous-led funds, and Indigenous funds, especially those that are on a growth trajectory, is a great opportunity for us to overcome some of the limitations that we have. The third reason I will say is we are interested in recreating a model of what does a nonprofit looks like. We want to see what does integrating principles that are based on Indigenous cosmovision look like. So we are investing not only in the capacity of those organizations to do their own re-granting, but also in their institutional capacity for them to create a model of nonprofit management that teaches some lessons in the sector. So one of the things that we are always interested in knowing is, how do Indigenous funds understand the concept of expanded governance models, and how do they integrate that into their practice, and so on. I will say the fourth reason of why we support Indigenous funds is because we have observed that there is an interesting transition in the Indigenous movement for more women and young people to be at the helm of some of these organizations. And we want to make a bet on those leaderships, and to also know that they will have the necessary resources for them to be able to carry those aspirations that they have. I will say over the last 5 years, our support, as I said earlier, has been incremental. We support funds like the Land Tenure Facility with grants that can go up to $15 million, and it is for resources to set up their systems. We also support national Indigenous organizations like the National Indigenous Organization of Colombia. But we also support Indigenous individuals like So for the last 10 years, we have supported the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous people. But the bulk of our resources at this moment, based on the context in which we are operating, is going to intermediaries and to organizations that are working with Indigenous people and in Indigenous territories. Obviously, that is not ideal, but in full transparency, that is where we are at the moment. We obviously hope that in the future, we can get to a place in which we can begin to provide more funding directly to organizations. I will say that in general, most of our institutional strengthening grants are grants that are 5 years. They have 2 components. They have general support and they have institutional strengthening support. In addition to that, we provide an opportunity for organizations to join a number of learning cohorts, such as the cohort on financial resilience or cybersecurity. In doing this, we have learned some lessons. The first lesson that we have learned is that we had to match our finance with our values and our narrative. That is a hard thing to do. And one of the things that we have been doing is now tracking the data in a rigorous manner to know exactly how much is going directly to Indigenous organizations based in territories, how much is going to Indigenous NGOs that work and are anchoring movements. We are also tracking the data that is going to intermediaries and others. And we have created a process in which we interrogate every 3 months some of the decisions that program officers are making in terms of the allocation of resources. The second thing that we learned is that we had to humble ourselves in terms of our understanding about what those results looks like in terms of a project. We came from a place of wanting to see tangible results, something that we could demonstrate. And it has been, I will say, a bit of a journey for the institution as a whole, you know. And one of the key drivers for this is that for a long time, we measured the performance of program officers at Ford on the basis of the products that they could deliver as program officers. So we also had to change our internal systems on how we measure performance so that then they could have more flexibility in understanding what does success in their tenure can look like so that they can support Indigenous organization. I said the third lesson that we learned is that we needed to balance our own requirements with the community needs. The COVID-19, I will say, represented a very profound and difficult lesson for us because for the first time, the trustees and the entire leadership of the Ford Foundation came together and in a matter of hours, change and remove most of the restrictions, you know, that we had put in place in terms of the way that the resources should be allocated, which then made it very difficult for them to go back. So if you could remove it then, why do you have to go back to some of that? But that is still a work in progress. And the last thing I will say that we have learned is that building strong relationships takes a long time. You know, and that again, that required changing the mentality and the format of the grant, and actually also our entire budgeting and finance operations at the Ford Foundation, so that teams will have the flexibility to make 5-year grants. You know, because we were used to seeing results, or we wanted to see results in 1 year, and we realized that this was not working for us. So up to now, I will say about 70% of our funding is done with under general support. But when it comes to indigenous organization, I will say that is still work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, for sharing Fort's lessons. And you certainly, as you probably also on the constellation map, Fort is one of the biggest funders when with data shows that it's supporting indigenous peoples. But there's still that little bit of work to do to see how much of that it's going to indigenous land, and not only in Fort, but across the philanthropic sector. I'd like to invite to the spotlight, Natalie, please. And Natalie is going to share with us on the topic of collaboration to extend support to indigenous communities and smaller organizations. Natalie Eagleton is the Chief Executive Officer of the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, with a 25-year career in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector in consulting, fundraising, and partnerships, as well as organizational development roles. She is passionate about facilitating effective and enduring responses to issues facing rural communities. Before joining FRRR, Natalie consulted with a matrix on board, working with numerous nonprofit organizations in program evaluation, undertaking research analysis, and developing business plans. And with that, I invite you to take the floor, Natalie.
Thank you, Lourdes, and thank you for that introduction, and Monica, for your words just then. It's great to hear about that. I am very grateful for being able to be here in this retreat this week, and it's just very grounding, and I feel very honoured to be in a space where I can learn and contribute to, you know, how philanthropy can do better and walk alongside First Nations communities and organisations, and feel particularly honoured to be able to say a few words in this session. So I, as Lourdes just said, I'm the CEO with the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, which is an unnecessarily long name for an organisation, and we tend to shorten by saying FRRR, which is equally not as easy to say all the time either. But we're an Australian foundation with a national footprint, and we, as the name suggests, have a focus on supporting remote, rural and regional communities across Australia. We were established about 21 years ago, so a youngish organisation, but in Australia, probably one that's been, you know, around for a while in terms of philanthropy and philanthropic organisations. And we were actually set up through an acknowledgement that rural communities were experiencing barriers to accessing philanthropy on a range of fronts. Partly because of the size of the country and the geography, and partly because of the small population sizes in our sort of inland areas of the country in particular, and the challenges sort of around social, economic, cultural, environmental conditions that are unique to that context. So we were set up through the Australian government and a family foundation, the Sydney Myer Fund, and the Myer family are quite a significant philanthropic family in Australia. So whilst we're an independent organisation, our origins are slightly interesting in that it was a stimulus, you know, contributed through government and philanthropy as essentially a collective philanthropy model that could enable funding to reach regional Australia from philanthropic foundations, governments, corporations, individuals wanting to give. And we were given, I don't know, for those that are not so familiar with Australian philanthropic structures, we have a very overcomplicated tax system, which presents a range of issues and problems for giving. And it affects remote communities and rural communities particularly, and it affects grassroots organisations particularly. So FRRR was given a special tax status in Australia that enables us to get money to places that are typically very hard to get them to. So that's kind of the, I guess, the structural side of FRRR. And in terms of the, I guess, the question of collaboration, you know, where we adopt a philosophy at FRRR that is a little challenging, given we're a national organisation and we're really working at the intersection of so many different issues. And we're also working at the interface of a range of different funding partners and hundreds of community partners. But our philosophy is really that, you know, the best approach for us to really drive sustainability and self-determination of communities is to take a grassroots and place-based approach to our funding. And so whilst we have a range of different grant programs and some of them are national and quite broad, we always approach that through the lens of localised context and through the lenses of people and place and the particular strengths of those two things together, and of course the things that need to be strengthened within those. So it is quite challenging as an organisation working at that scale to take that approach, and I think that the question of collaboration is particularly powerful in that context as well. So in thinking about, you know, this conversation today, I approached it through the perspective of the 4 R's of Indigenous philanthropy and thought about what collaboration means in that context and what we have been learning and thinking about at FRRR. And we're certainly, we're very early in our journey in this work, and we've got some fairly big transformational things to do as an organisation to really shift our practices. But we're committed to that, and we're you know, asking ourselves questions all the time about, you know, how we can actually work and how we can align what we believe and what we value with our practices, and how we can really walk alongside First Nations communities. And I'm immensely grateful to those that have been generous in helping us along that journey as well, as early as it is. So I think that the thing that comes to mind in collaboration is that it is about working together towards a common goal. And when we think about the structures that philanthropy puts around its funding, it's quite the antithesis of that sometimes. And that's what I'm wrestling with at the moment, and what we're wrestling with a bit at FRRR. You know, when I think about the processes that we apply in terms of funding applications and reporting back on what happened to the money and all of the structures that more mainstream philanthropy puts around funding, it's really not conducive to collaboration, and it's really not conducive to fostering those 4 R's if we think about responsibility and relationships and reciprocity and respect. You know, I particularly feel that the structures we have in our philanthropy are not really anchored in reciprocity, and I don't know why I can't say that word today. Usually can. And that's, I think, something we can think about quite deeply in the concept of collaboration. But one of the other things that I think I've been asked to speak to is what we are hearing and noticing in our partnerships with Indigenous organisations, particularly those smaller, more grassroots organisations. And so when I'm thinking about collaboration, I'm thinking at that level of very localised, and sometimes organisations that don't have a lot of resourcing and that are playing many, many roles in their communities, and then are not necessarily all that visible to the funding system. And so we feel at FRRR we've got a role to, you know, try to get as close to the ground as we can within those organisations. So as far as capacity, and I guess what the call for collaboration is that we're hearing at FRRR, we're hearing and noticing that First Nations organisations have been called on significantly, particularly in the COVID crisis, and also in things like natural disasters like bushfires and floods. But they're under-resourced, and they're often only brought in during the crisis or straight after the crisis rather than before, to help the design of programs and support mechanisms. And there are some live examples that we're working with at the moment where it's we've been invited into some conversations about how to help funding reach some communities, and it's almost been an afterthought of, oh gosh, you know, these Aboriginal organisations have been asked to step up and they haven't been resourced and they haven't been consulted about how the best way to do this would be. And now we're retrofitting some of the design. And so there's a clear lesson there about, how we actually build these types of programs to be led from those communities and those organisations rather than asking them in afterwards. A theme that we're hearing and seeing in our work, and that I've heard quite a bit through the last couple of days, is that women are carrying a really heavy load, and they're carrying a very heavy burden in their communities and in their organisations. And there's limited capacity building support that's appropriate for their context and that is really aligned with an enabling process for them to participate or receive appropriate capacity building support, particularly around their time, their ability to be away from community, and opportunities to help them with cultural healing. And we're hearing that a lot in the context of leadership concepts and the role that women are playing in leading their communities and how much they're holding, and just the concern about actually the burnout that will happen for those women. And so we are listening into how we might support what philanthropy would fund are not right. So we're thinking about, well, how do we support the design of that from community as well, and from those women, and how do we walk alongside and try not to come up with solutions, which is what sometimes we can inadvertently do. I think we're also hearing about an ongoing tension between Western governance structures and traditional knowledge and governance systems, and some of that came up in Monica's words earlier. And alongside that, there's also a piece about developing the next generation's capacity to walk in both worlds and to lead strong organisations within frames that are both able to work within the mainstream requirements, but also to influence different types of relationships with funding bodies. And I think, young people are really coming with some really different energy and some different experiences. But there's also the challenge of ensuring that their traditional knowledge is really sustained and supported and nurtured through that as well. And I guess the challenge is that funders can perpetuate that dynamic of continuing to grapple with Western or mainstream governance approaches to funding and partnerships. But I think philanthropy is also where we've actually got the greatest flexibility to be able to adapt and to be able to really shift our practices and think about what governance could look like, from a funder perspective that would actually support confidence in the the funding, but also enable a lot more self-determination in those partnerships and a lot more trust and a lot more accountability on the funder side as well for that relationship. And further to, I think, some of the other things we've been hearing about is that measures of success are really, what's asked for by a lot of mainstream funding around measures of success is quite misaligned with what success actually means for First Nations organisations and Indigenous-led organisations. And we're having conversations about that internally. We have these grant agreements that are like a contract of sorts. And, I've been looking at those with fresh eyes over the last while and saying, well, A, why are we putting this document together? Does it mean anything? Is it actually useful? Are these measures actually even measures that mean anything? And often they're the measures that mean something are not quantifiable. And I think we should be okay with that. And yes, Tanya, application forms, absolutely. The other end of the spectrum is a big piece that we're keen to transform. And we want to do that in collaboration and partnership with some First Nations organisations for our work and really co-design what a completely different process might be. And Jill, who's on the session today, has had some great sort of thoughts about how we start to do that. And I think the other piece that I would just add that we're noticing, particularly for smaller organisations, is that it's actually really hard for them to compete for funding with the large NGOs. And there was a great comment sometime this week about scale and breadth. And when we think about the grassroots organisations that we support and partner with, their breadth is absolutely phenomenal. They are working across everything in their communities, and they are, everything is so integrated in community, and it means that they're so much busier, and their resources are so much more stretched, and they're wearing so many hats, and they're advocating for so many needs. And what we hear is that they have to pick and choose really carefully about which funding programs they go for, because they just don't have the resources to actually be in the mix of everything. And what that ultimately ends up meaning often is that the NGOs, the non-Indigenous organisations, end up with quite a bit of the funding, because they do have the resources to compete, and they do have the ability to be in that mix all the time and throw their hat in the ring for every program. And I don't have an answer to that at all, but I think it's a really big thing that we need to be thinking about. And it's about the constructs of how accessible funding is, and it's about how well-designed funding processes are to ensure that they're accessible and that they're not actually presenting a barrier. And we certainly haven't got that right yet at FRRR, except that we do prioritise grassroots organisations over larger NGOs as a sort of first rule. So I think that is something I'm noticing more and more in our context. And then finally, I think that the collaboration opportunity from our perspective at FRRR is in taking responsibility as a non-Indigenous organisation to actually respond and to dismantle those barriers within the influence that we have, and to really amplify the voices and the work of Indigenous organisations, and try to at least play a role in shifting those constructs to the degree that we can. And as an organisation that works with so many different funders, we can actually provide a safety of sorts, because it's a bit of a risk. This kind of shifting of practice can be seen as risky for foundations at times, and can be seen as a big requirement to change really long-held practices. And so there's, I think, a role for organisations like FRRR and other sort of intermediary type organisations to, I guess, foster some practice change in a way that creates safety for those funders who are, less able perhaps to do that. But I say all of that with the caveat that, we're on a deep and long learning journey, and we welcome collaboration on co-designing all of these things.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you. Thank you for sharing about the work that you are doing. I'm gonna move to invite Yuri to take the floor. And Yuri will be sharing with us on the topic of accountability, funder accountability to the communities they claim they are serving and supporting. A little bit about Yuri. Yuri Futimura was born in Japan and immigrated to the US in her early years, and grew up bilingual and bicultural. She joined Newfield Foundation as one of the first employees and helped develop a grant-making program and operations to support rural women's organizations in West Africa. Currently, she is Director of Finance and Programs at Tamalpais Trust, supporting an Indigenous-led council to award grants and to Indigenous-led organizations and networks globally. Yuri, I invite you to take the floor.
Thank you, Lourdes. Good morning, good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with you all. And thank you, IFIP, for coordinating, organizing the 2 tracks. I started the conference in track B when I was in Japan, and now I am in California. So I was able to join track A today, but rejoining track B this evening. And it's been great to be part of both sets of conversations. So when Lourdes invited me to speak on this topic, I first thought to myself, oof, Lourdes, aren't we friends? Just teasing, but I'm going to try to address this topic the only way I know how, which is by speaking from our experience at Tamalpais Trust. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Tamalpais Trust, TAM Trust, we're a 20-year charitable trust based in coastal Miwok territory, also known as Marin County, just north of San Francisco, here in California. We're a relatively small funder small foundation. But our entire purpose is to support Indigenous-led organizations and networks around the world. So it was only natural, or actually quite necessary, for us to start investing in Indigenous-led funds several years ago. We are an institution with a non-Indigenous trustee and non-Indigenous staff, myself included, and we wanted to decenter ourselves from the decision-making process. We wanted to shift power from ourselves to Indigenous-led funds who were closer to Indigenous communities, were closer to their contexts and realities, who have relationships based on trust and reciprocity, and could provide the ongoing mentorship and technical assistance that can make these grants most successful. And as such, we were one of the seed funders for Pawanka Fund and the Arctic Indigenous Fund, and continue to be proud funders. And over the last several years, we have supported in total 18 different Indigenous-led funds in different parts of the world and in different stages of development. And our funding to them is unrestricted, as much as is allowable under expenditure responsibility for foreign grants. But over the last few years, we realized that this was not enough. And I should be clear that when I say we, I mean for us, it all starts from the top, from our trustee. And I don't think he would describe himself this way, but he is a true radical, way ahead of his time, always trying to push the envelope within the trust and all his philanthropic institutions for us to walk our walk. And I know that we are very unique in this regard. You know, we're not a Ford, we're small, and that allows us to be nimble. And we realized that even while investing in Indigenous-led funds was meaningful and values aligned, we needed to take it further and go deeper. We needed to continue to decolonize. We were still deciding which Indigenous-led funds would get support and how much. We were still the decision makers. We had to get out of our comfort zones, and we needed to get uncomfortable. So a year ago, the trustee invited 3 Indigenous leaders to form a council who now call themselves our Navigation Council. Their mandate is to guide and lead our grant making, and they're just concluding their first year of grant making, and it was a year of transition for the trust in all different ways. We transitioned out of some grant relationships. We are continuing and renewing others. And the Navigation Council has brought in new relationships. And their new grants are based on mutual trust and mutual understanding. The grants are mostly for general support, institutional support, and capacity building, because the Navigation Council knows that is what's needed, where the gaps are for support. We've also transitioned staff internally. We no longer have an ED, and other changes are unfolding. My role has changed. I no longer have a grants portfolio, as I've stepped back from my relationships and made space for the Navigation Council to build their own. And I see my role now as creating the conditions for the Navigation Council to do their best work, to build good relations. And what does this look like? This looks like, for me, collaborating and co-creating with them our data analysis and learning tool and Tableau, so that the council can continue to learn from their grant making and refine it as they go. This looks like helping them to create a project management tool so they can manage their grants and other related activities. It means signing them up for the IFIP conference. We are their support staff. And it turns out that I'm a big nerd when it comes to systems and tools and procedures, so it suits me just fine. And I'm lucky because they're a fabulous group and just a pleasure and joy to work with. And I hope you get a chance to interact and meet some of them on this retreat. So this is where we are in our evolution at Tamalpais Trust, to decolonize ourselves. But I know the work is not yet done, and we need to continue to peel back the layers of colonial practices and then learn them and replenish them with other ways of learning and being. So I share our story, our journey so far in answering the question about funders' accountability to the communities we serve. I believe philanthropy needs to do better, that we can do better and more to be representative of the people we claim to serve. They need to be at the table making more of the decisions about the allocation of grants to their communities, but they also need to be part of leading the designing of the process, having the relationships, even changing the language we use in philanthropy. And I'm encouraged by what I saw in the murals about the changes our institution all of our institutions collectively have made in the last year. And the global pandemic has pushed us to be more responsible, flexible, and adaptable, or that we need to be. And so I call on all of us to, continue pushing the envelope from within our institutions. Let's get uncomfortable together. And I will be the first to admit that there have been many moments this year where I felt uncomfortable. But if we are uncomfortable, we know that we're on the right path. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuri. And I love your mention that you like, you guys don't know, but you and I met many, many years ago now when we were both starting, I think, to get engaged with another network. So we've known each other for quite some time now. Thank you for sharing. It's great actually to just hear from you the changes that are happening at Tamalpayas. And I look forward to engaging with the Navigation Council. All right, so we are at time, almost at time, and I am looking at Anka, who's helping us facilitate this. And I think for next, I'm going to hand it over to you, Anka. Yes, thank you, Anka.
That sounds good. Thank you, Lourdes, and thank you to all three of you. What inspirational words, three very different foundations and different grant making styles, but it's amazing to see the changes that are happening internally. And Yuri, the feeling uncomfortable and going through discomfort to really coming through the other side. This is exactly what we want to see, exactly what we're going to continue to dive deeper into today. And we're going to start doing that with our daily interactive. I'm sure most of you know the drill by now. So we're going to do a quick interactive and look at a mural before we go to break. And then we're going to come back from break and go straight into the breakout groups and start our Minca discussions. So today, again, as a reminder, we're thinking about what commitments are we making for 2022. There are already a lot of commitments on this board from track A, from also thank you to the few of you who are participating in track A. I'm sure you'll see lots of your post-its here too. So I think the IFIP team has put the link in the Zoom chat. So first step is ingresando, is getting into the mural. And then once you're in the mural, we're gonna zoom in here. You can click on my icon to follow me. We're gonna zoom in here and see the question and the more detailed question, right? Of what commitments are we making for 2022? More specifically, what work will you commit to doing as an individual within an organization, or perhaps as your organization along with your team, that moves us forward? And before we start filling in the post-its, I want to remind us what Chanda showed us in the mural from day 2, from yesterday's track. These were some of the big categories that you all want to see IFIP community bloom into, and a little bit of what you want to see yourself bloom into, right? So we have these ideas of, more focus on regions. I think that's especially present here in this track. New types of collaboration, new ways to collaborate within the IFIP community, but also potentially within your organization. Talks about co-funding and funding those hard to reach places. I think we heard a lot from Natalie on that. Partnerships, we want to expand the partnerships in a reciprocal way. We want to be a champion of intersectionality. That definitely came out in day 2 yesterday. We want, of course, more convenings and more in-person gatherings and convenings. And then as a reminder, we want to be a learning space, a resource hub that also shares best practices. And then we want to start to be recognized as a leader and creating stronger teams, stronger leaders, and advocating for expertise. So that is a reminder of everything that we want to see the IFIP community bloom into. I don't want you to limit yourself to only that, but I do want you to start thinking about, what commitments can we make to ourselves as the community, as the IFIP community, but also, what does this look like in your organization? And that might look different, right? So I'm going to give you all a few minutes to start. Yes, I see some folks already starting to write on the Post-its. Just as a reminder, you just simply click on a Post-it and then you double click to start typing. And yeah, so let's start typing away. For those of you who have already responded in track A, please feel free to respond again. And in a few minutes, I will send us off to break, but I wanted to get the juices flowing a little bit to start thinking about what are our commitments for the next year. Continuing to shift funding into Indigenous-led decision-making structures. Yuri definitely impressed and inspired with that. Strengthening our actions to incubate Indigenous-led funds, but also ... something more. More engagement between board and community partners. Co-design. I love to see that as a designer myself. Co-design granting processes in collaboration with partner orgs. That's powerful. Excellent. All right, so feel free to keep typing. I'm going to send us off to a break of just 10 minutes. Hello. So as you're coming back, what you're seeing now is the discussion questions that are going to guide the discussion in these two breakouts. So I'm going to read through them, and then I'm going to read through them as we trickle on back. So for breakout 7, we're focusing on collaboration to extend support to Indigenous communities and smaller organizations. We heard a lot of inspirational words from the work that Natalie is doing. So the questions here are, what are different ways that people want to work to do this or can work to do this? What are different ways and collaborations people want to engage in on this topic? Some examples here. And then finally, and this is where we've brought in Indigenous-led funds, so we can also cover this. The question here is, how can funders support Indigenous-led funds that then support Indigenous communities and smaller organizations, right? So that is breakout 7. Breakout 8 is on funder accountability. Funder accountability to the communities they claim to be serving and supporting. The 3 questions here are, what stops most funders from directly funding Indigenous peoples-led organizations? Why do funders prioritize and trust non-Indigenous-led organizations more? The second is, what stops funders from supporting or creating Indigenous-led funds? How can funders support Indigenous-led funds, right? So really focusing on the funds in that second piece. Then finally, what does real concrete accountability in philanthropic practice look like, right? So 2 breakouts, they're each going to be amazing. I am 100% sure of that. But start thinking about which one you want to go into. And before we divide up into our breakouts, what we're going to do now is hear from track A, just from a colleague of ours, Adrian, who presented back on specifically the Indigenous-led funds track, so that we could hear a little bit about what that very interesting and thought-provoking conversation was. And we will then split out into breakout groups. So IFIP team, I'll hand it over to you.
I have to say that I think one of the most comments I've seen is on the music. So I thank Rachel for putting that playlist together. The other one is on the foundation map. I think, when IFIP is ready to share more on that, we certainly can have a more extensive conversation. There's a lot of technicality there that it's hard to explain in a very short, brief conversation. But there are ways of influencing Candid, and I've done that in the past while I was at Christensen Fund, because they kept asking us for our data, but the data, their taxonomy has to do with taxonomy. Any database has to do with taxonomy. Their taxonomy was not representative of what Christensen was funding. So we managed to influence that. So as IFIP becomes more with a stronger team, is able to do some of these other things that are also necessary. We'll be updating the community about how you all can engage in the process, and certainly any support that we can offer, and for those that you opt-in to share your data. You may want to raise your volume.
Putting on these last 3 days and bringing a conversation, that has really needed to be had, and having strong truth telling as part of that. I know that I will not capture the depth of the conversation that we had in 55 minutes, and was 55 minutes enough? I think by the end of it is we were all thinking that where did the 55 minutes go to? But we're exploring Indigenous-led funds, and one of the things that we grasped onto that kind of fed through the whole conversation was, was there a need for Indigenous led funds? And it kind of sprinkled through the conversation the whole time. And I'll try to capture this in a couple of very quick dot points. Not only Indigenous led funds about whether they're needed, but also kind of the value of them, how they can operate, and then what we need to do. So we've spoken over this topic, not just today in the 55 minutes. It's actually come up over the last 3 days. And I think where we would have landed and where we have landed is that we've spoken about it for so long that now it's time to stop talking and to start acting. However, with Indigenous-led funds, we need to be considering, do they actually have enough resources? And if we are to set them up, they do need to have those resources. We need to ensure that they simply don't replicate the current colonial practices, that starting a fund and having funding going into it is a starting point, but the gold standard is actually having an endowment attached to that, so it has sustainability beyond scrambling around and trying to raise funds every year. And lastly is that the commitment from the individuals, but also IFIP in moving forward to actually see this occur. I think internationally is kind of where we walked away from. Thank you.
Excellent. So that was just a little bit of a recap from one of the conversations had. Again, the one that's baked into both of the breakouts that we're about to split into. So with that, with a little bit of inspiration from our 3 speakers, plus what Adrian just shared, I want to split us up into breakout groups. Actually, our last breakout for the IFIP 2021 retreat. How was it? I hope that you all enjoyed it. Great.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to hear what you all have to share back. The note stock, as per usual, looks not only long, but really amazing and deep. So why don't we start with the share backs? Let's start with breakout 7. Rachel, who is presenting from your group?
Tanya is going to be presenting, yes.
As Rachel and Niall both said that I'd get dubbed in eventually, they weren't in my group, so I dubbed myself in. Right, we were speaking specifically about collaboration to extend support to Indigenous communities and smaller organisations. So I'm just going to move this screen over. Before I get into this, I want to give you guys a bit of an overview and then I'll go into the specifics, but we all brought really different perspectives to this conversation. And if one person would present, you know, a pathway, there was always at least 2 other like really great perspectives that showed, well, that pathway has limitations and why you're making those assumptions, and really, really rich. And a lot of it was put down. So I really encourage everyone to read the full document. I'm going to try and do an overview, but please read through it. There was amazing stuff raised. So thanks to everyone in our group. So we had 3 questions, which was, what are different ways that we want to work on getting more funding to Indigenous communities and small orgs? Different ways that we could do this and collaborate, and then how could we support Indigenous-led funds? But before we get into Indigenous-led funds, we had an excellent conversation about, is that even something we should be pursuing? But I'll come to that. So how people want to work on this is, some people want to have dedicated funds specifically for Indigenous peoples and local people, and supporting them to get to all the way through from implementation and reporting. So it's challenging that the whole system is for not designed for Indigenous people and local communities. Some people are getting to make the decision on which projects they want to fund. Some are going and building relationships, trying to connect to other funders. Some are trying to grow Indigenous-led funds. People are saying that you could join up processes and move away from sort of written processes. We then had a whole separate conversation. I'll come back to that last one, Gordon, but and having an advisory committee. So about having Indigenous communities and orgs advising, which then structures all the way through from the board to the ops. But then I think a really big thing was this sort of conversation again that kept coming up about that these systems aren't really appropriate a lot of the time. Like, we're having people coming in and speaking and picking up the elite in some of the Indigenous communities and skewing some of the balances in terms of gender, and, you know, romanticizing that engaging with Indigenous communities without really understanding what's deeply happening on the ground, and just going, well, we're engaging with Indigenous people, it must be good. So that was a really good critique of like being more careful about how we're operating. And then in terms of, at the moment, there's a lot of big organizations wanting to engage with First Nations people for anything that they're doing. And they need to be like really more careful on their commitment, their long-term relationships, and who's supporting them and giving them permission. And then in terms of how we can collaborate, people want to learn more about how to incubate Indigenous-led funds and governance, look at our issues in sort of, see, this is what I mean. We're just talking about so many things, but just a high level, talking about issues in our grant, like in terms of like foundation maps to have information, maybe have funding pools, looking at like different research, making safe spaces for elders, particularly to be able to store knowledge safely and protect their data sovereignty, and invest more in capacity building, and making sure that funders are amplifying these messages to other funders so that we can get like more people putting a First Nations lens. It was about, yes, supporting Indigenous-led funds, also looking at geographical coverage of Indigenous-led funds, but then the discussion was, well, if you do that and you're not looking at the right scale, you're probably going to miss that there's actually Indigenous-led funds happening, or you're projecting the model that could be happening, so needing to be really careful. But a big part, and I sort of want to come to this, because there's a lot more you can talk about this, but I think that the whole concept that an Indigenous-led fund does not necessarily mean funds get to more Indigenous people. It's not about who leads this, but how are the funds governed and managed. So, you know, if we end up with the Indigenous-led funds being the elite leadership again of Indigenous groups, we could just end up having the same old protocols as current philanthropy. And I love what was said, it's the same banana with different names. So I think that real caution of going forward with Indigenous-led funds, like, you know, just, and in any funding in this space, is being really cautious. So there's heaps of stuff more. Please have a look, and thank you to my group. And I apologize if I missed your key points.
That definitely sounded like a very intense conversation, and I love that it was so rich because there were so many perspectives and a lot of collaboration in the conversation. That sounds amazing, and I'm excited to dig more into the notes, which I've put down in the Zoom links so everyone can dig in. Let's now hear from Breakout 8 that focused on accountability, on funder accountability.
Eloise is going to be reporting back.
Yeah, certainly. So we also had 3 questions that we explored looking at funder accountability. The first was looking at what stops funders from funding more Indigenous-led organisations. And I think the first really big component of this is thinking about, you know, what you're measuring against when you're making these decisions. And so, you know, often the reaction is to think, you know, low risk means bigger not-for-profits, but actually that needs to be reframed as low risk is actually being closer to community, because it's the communities that hold the knowledge and expertise of what's needed, not necessarily those large, well-resourced not-for-profits. And yeah, it is communities hold knowledge. It's not universities or consultants who kind of sit external and outside, but are typically, you know, viewed as the Western sources of knowledge. And then lastly, I guess, overcoming the institutional racism that frames what's considered as good, and really acknowledging that you don't have the answers because you don't have that knowledge and expertise. And so that's kind of the stick you measure against. But then I think there's also a failure to recognise the history. And we spoke a bit about the kind of chicken and egg situation of historically Indigenous-led organisations haven't been funded. And so they haven't been able to develop that resource and capability, which means it kind of flows on to them not having the infrastructure. And so how do you kind of end that cycle of just continuing to under-resource? And an important element of that too that we spoke about is not just funding projects, funding like the core operations and the flexibly funding those core operations to be able to build the organizational infrastructure and capacity to then enable, like, to counteract that cycle and I guess make it more of a positive one. The second question that we looked at was around Indigenous-led funds, and real acknowledgement, most of our group was Australian, and there is quite a, I guess, a lack of Indigenous-led funds in the Australian landscape. But I guess some of the things that we spoke about was, you know, kind of need to stop being safe and be willing to be uncomfortable, and to perhaps, referencing Adrian's point, less talk and more action. And we just need to be uncomfortable and start testing and trying things, but through that we should connect and collaborate and learn from others who have done this and can provide the guidance to us. And then the last question was about what does real accountability look like? So some of that was about being transparent and making sure we're sharing options, sharing our opportunities to Indigenous-led networks, so how we kind of getting the word out there. Also being willing to kind of evaluate ourselves and hold ourselves to the same standards that we expect of our grantees. And then quite an interesting conversation around, what is there is no mechanism for Indigenous organisations to provide feedback on bad philanthropy or poor practices. And so how can you, are there mechanisms that are needed to enable that to happen? And so, is engaging in more media could be a solution to that, because by having news out there about what you're doing, it kind of does help to keep you to account. It doesn't quite do the feedback loop, but there is, I guess, then more awareness and other people who might ask you and hold you to account. But also recognition, I guess, in Australia, there's some tall poppy syndrome as well. And so, how do you navigate those conversations if you feel that it's just going to get shut down and torn to pieces? And then last point was around looking at, like a cultural audit toolkit could be a useful way to think about, assessing where our organizations are at, but also planning those next steps. And I think that's kind of the critical part of, again, not just talking, but making sure you translate through into action. Yeah, so that was my brief summary, but the notes had a lot more detail.
Amazing, and a lot of aha moments in there that I was having as you were presenting back. Thank you to both presenters. Excellent job. I felt like I was somewhat there in the conversation, so thank you. And now we're going to start winding down. Thanks again to everyone for these last 3 days. It's been amazing to be with all of you. And I will now pass it on to Lourdes.
Yeah, I can't believe we're at the moment of closing. We prepared for a few months to bring this virtual retreat. I appreciate all of you for staying with us through the 3 days. What I like to do now is maybe just share a little bit of what's next for IFIP, and I won't share my screen because we're a small group here, and I like to actually switch it to gallery on my view so I can see all of you. But what I like to share is if those of you who were with us on the first day, I show a little bit of sort of our roadmap on where we had been or what we had been doing the last 5 years, which really focused on strengthening the organization. We had been around for 20 years, and we needed to now focus on strengthening the organization to respond to the many things that we've been hearing from and being asked to do, but asked to do with not enough resources or with like the 2 staff. And so investing on organizational strengthening was key over the last 5 years. We were very fortunate to have good and strong relationship with some of our funders and definitely members. And so where we're heading now, and you heard Winnie share this morning, getting to know more of the membership. Definitely we want to do a funding landscape analysis, and that includes all of you in Australia, those who are doing this work. What's the funding landscape for Indigenous peoples? And that's going to be more of a global kind of landscape analysis, but part of that is getting to know our members, understanding where you're all funding, supporting to make connections, We do know that the next phase for this organizational strengthening has to do with communications. The only way that we can continue to get the word out, to continue to change narrative, is by investing on our own communications and on communications tools. And so we'll be doing that. And Winnie shared also that we'll be asking all of you to let us know what you want to see in the next phase, because it's all about communicating out to the world what needs to happen and how Indigenous peoples need to be supported and funded. Lastly, one of the other things that I shared on track A as a commitment from IFIP is that our next hire would be someone that will be dedicated to supporting Indigenous-led funds. And we have a working group of Indigenous-led funds, and we have an awesome work plan. And mainly I've been doing all the work, but now we're at a place that we need to bring someone to really serve that community in the way that they deserve to be served. And that means that we need a dedicated person to do that work. And to also bring those conversations and create, and I think, also programming, and I heard from the murals programming that it's on your time zone as well. And so we have now a team that is spread more globally that will enable us to do that. But the other thing, maybe what I can do, and I won't share my screen, but if I can ask Anka to put on the mural, to put the link to mural, because there's a lot of commitments and that have been made there. And the IFIP team, what we'll now do is to look at everything, sit with this, and come back to all of you, because we're talking about accountability. So we also need to be definitely accountable to our members, but we actually also are accountable to the Indigenous movement. And so we need to take a look at this and see what's actually going to be also supportive of the Indigenous movement, so that we're not doing IFIP one thing, but not paying attention to what Indigenous organizations, Indigenous networks, Indigenous-led funds are saying. But let me take a look at a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. I love the fact that there's a group of you that are committing to more flexible and restricted support. That's definitely necessary. And I think we touched on our breakout just now. The funders are not just funding projects. They're a little bit of you're only funding a specific period of time on a larger life plan of Indigenous communities. Challenging internal structures. We heard from Monica earlier how Ford, one of the largest foundations, is even doing that. And I know Monica has been playing a very important role there as the only Indigenous staff at a large foundation, at Ford Foundation. Then there are other commitments to explore new funding models. This is very exciting. There's quite a few of the stickies there. So I won't read them. Continue learning, prioritizing self-care. I love this one. We've been, as you heard from Indigenous Climate Action, this is really important. And some of the things that on the flexible and exploring funding models, think about the self-care as well. And last, maybe just last more, a little one, working informed by Indigenous needs, and maybe in this one, co-design granting processes in collaboration with partner organizations. This is a fantastic idea, and more support to Indigenous-led funds. So all of these commitments are fantastic. I think we're ending at a moment exactly where we wanted to be. I have to confess that we were thinking about the retreat, when I was kind of taking the decision not to bring keynotes, not to bring panels, to move us into more of a dialogue. It's a big risk because let's face it, the funding community is so stuck in their ways. They love the keynotes. We love the panels, and that's all fantastic. But the real work happens on what you were all doing the last 3 days, talking, discussing, sharing ideas, and then arriving to commitment. So I appreciate that you were with us for the last 3 days and that you did all that work. The work that sometimes is not easy because it's very easy to sit back and listen. It's a little more difficult to actually step in and engage in dialogue and hear from other people and sit with that learning, right? And hopefully that learning you'll carry on and it won't stay just with you, but you'll take it to other places, to other colleagues in the funding sector in Australia. And so this is not a goodbye because IFIP, as you heard from Monica, I actually have been talking to my board about, we have this group of IFIP members that want us to do more in Australia. So the board is aware of that. So we'll come back and I'm excited about what opportunities are to come to continue this conversation with all of you. But with that, I want to again thank the team, Anka, for being with us for 3 days, and to our transcribers who have been with us and the language interpreters. And I believe now we're going to be closing with the closing offering words from Alma here, who led us into a closing ceremony in the morning. And I'll invite one of my colleagues to play that, please.
Es que no tenía el intérprete, por eso no había escuchado. Muchas gracias a todas.
Thank you very much, everyone.
De nuevo, muchas gracias por su luz, por su fuerza también, por seguir tejiendo hilos de muchos colores desde sus organizaciones y espacios para poder.
All that you from your organizations and your thank you for your leadership. These leadership today, I'd like to share with you these two elements, strength and the incense. And please turn on cameras. Please open your hands, thanking the heart of the sky and the heart of the earth for all the blessings. Feel that the smoke from the copal incense smudging you and cleansing you. That it is cleansing spirit and cleansing your being. Feel that it is cleansing feet, your legs, your abdomen, your heart, your head. Feel power of the copal and guard, hold this power in you. And we're all weavers, so honor yourself as a weaver. If you are a donor, honor the way that you weave. If you are an Indigenous leader, Feel how you weave and feel how the copal is cleansing you and strengthening you. Feel the power of the copal. May the copal strengthen your power to weave and to lead. Close your hands, study your spirit, and just show some reverence for Mother Earth. Tilt your head down to her to thank her. The light and power of this candle isn't for us, it's for others. Could be your daughter. It could be for the people that you work with and your co-workers and your team. It could be for the space where you're working from. It could be for your home. So this light is for the people that help you to do what you do. Now we're going to unite these two elements, the incense and the fire. And we're going to cleanse ourselves and all that's around us and those that we love and that we work with. And each and every one of you blessed and cleansed and smudged by the strength of the universe. So now we ask that the outcomes of this conference flourish and that we continue to make good decisions. And we also ask that the states and the governments do good work for Indigenous peoples and women and their community. So we offer this light and this incense to give us strength for our work and our vision. Now I ask us to close our eyes. We can rub our hands together and let us give thanks for this space that has allowed us to serve others and support others and accompany them. Now let us put our hands over our heart and another hand over our head where we have our wisdom that guides us. Now let's put our hands on our lap, on our legs, and thank our legs for our path. And now let us unite our hands and show our reverence. And let us express our gratitude once, twice, 3 times. Let us give thanks for our gathering, for our coming together for this space. And let us thank the spirits and ancestors that accompanied us. Now let us lift up our hands to the sky and ask that the results and the outcomes of our dialogue have clout and power. And now let us applaud and make a sound that symbolizes the unity of our hands coming together and of ourselves coming together for good. So we thank these two elements, and they will continue to burn and continue to send you strength and energy and blessings. Thank you. Thank you for your light. And I hope with this blessing, you persevere with the strength of this blessing. Thank you very much.
Again, thank you so much for staying. Just a reminder, you have access to the conference platform for, I believe, a year. And so if you wanted to watch those, any of the breakouts or the other conversations that happen, you'll be finding those videos in the next week while our team puts the videos up. But you have access and you'll be able to find that there. Thank you again. It was fantastic to be part of this group. And I look forward to the ongoing learning and the collaboration. And I look forward to the next time we're all together to hear what you were all up to and what changes have you made.